So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we've been doing our stretches, just little kind of calisthenics just to get us into the conversation. But today we need to spend a lot of time into the text. But what I would like us to think about today is the meaning of life. And I'm serious about it. Like I'm not trying to be flippant with it. But in some ways, it would be interesting to get a sense of what we think of when we think of the meaning of life. And we'll just take a couple minutes for this because I believe that by the end of today, we're going to at least have one approach to answering the question, what is the meaning of your life? But let's just start, we're stretching. You can't be wrong. I'll push a little bit, and let's just get started. What do you think? Have any of you thought that question? What's the meaning of life? To have purpose. I'll try my best for the sake of the recording to respond or to repeat what you say. The meaning of life is for life to have purpose. I love that. You want to unpack that a little bit more, or should we keep going? Do you want to say more about purpose, or? Okay, great. Go ahead, please.
Micah 6:8.
Micah 6:8. So the meaning of life is to live a righteous life. Is that what you mean, or what would you say? What did you get from Micah 6:8?
Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
That's going to definitely be right there for Luther too. Absolutely. But what meaning does that present? Just to push for the sake of the conversation. Like, what do you get out of it? It can't be wrong. Like, there might not even be an answer to this. I'm just pushing because you started with the conclusion, right? To have purpose. This is great. This is awesome. Keep going. To be a part of something that's bigger than me. This is fantastic. Anybody else? To feel good. Absolutely. Why not? This is all fantastic. It's a very difficult thing to come at, isn't it? What is the meaning of life? Like, why are you here, ultimately? And, you know, part of the fun of answering that question is, what does that answer look like when it's me giving the answer? What does that answer look like if it's somebody who lives in a culture that I've never understood, that has a totally different access to resources? Every one of us in this room is among the richest people who have ever lived in the entire history of this planet. You have more resources than the Pharaoh would have had during the time of Joseph. I mean, if the Pharaoh would have gotten the flu in the time of Joseph, what's he going to do, right? What are his kids going to do? When I get the flu, one of my kids get the flu, I'm very confident that we'll be able to manage that. So it's not just the money, it's the access to resources and technology. So we are all exceedingly rich. I had a seminary professor who used to kind of every now and again say, he was from Guyana, and he'd kind of, he would say, I've never understood how I'm supposed to respond to a North American student who thinks they're poor. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say. When you say you are poor, I don't get it. And so maybe life has different meanings where you're at. I don't know. So it's hard to answer the question. Here's what I'm going to suggest. I don't have an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? But I think by the end of today, I will be able to at least present you with a sense of what that might look like, where meaning might come from. Is that okay if we get started? Let's do. I'd like to start with a story. You shared a story with me. I have a microphone, so I'm going to try and kind of state the story that you shared with me, right? You were part of a support group, right? Can you remind me kind of where that came from?
31 years ago this month, our son, who was a Red Cross certified lifeguard, went to save a friend who had just fallen through thin ice. They both drowned.
So I'm going to stop. He's saying for this, 31 years ago, his son jumped into water to save someone who was drowning. Both of them ended up dying. 31 years ago. Okay. Okay.
My wife and I had a lot of trouble dealing with that and coping with this situation. we were doing things that I thought I personally was going crazy.
Yeah.
I was doing weird things and all this. Lo and behold, a stranger approached us and said, "Do you know there's a support group for parents who've lost children?" Nope. So we started going. And after we started going to the support group, and we kept up. It met once a month, every Sunday night, the McKinley Room at the University Hospital. And at the end of about 2 years of doing this, we started to kind of feel like we maybe could help somebody else. So we kept going. 17 years later, we left the support group because we felt burnt out and nobody could replace us. So we just dropped out of the whole situation for a couple of years. And then Cedar Memorial came along and said, "We're starting up a new support group. Did you want to join?" Well, we had all kinds of literature from the previous support group, which was a worldwide organization, the Compassionate Friends. So we thought maybe we could give out some literature for some people to help. Well, we ended up ending that meeting with Harriet and I being the new leaders of that group that was forming. So for 6 years, we were the facilitators at Cedar Memorial's sponsorship of a support group for parents living with loss was the name of the group. It was a strange situation because leaving Cedar Memorial about, say, 9 o'clock on a Sunday night and heading towards Marion, there was hardly any activity. That big, busy intersection on Collins Road, First Avenue, was usually busy, but it was empty most nights, Sunday nights. All the smart people, I suppose, home, either getting ready for bed or something. And during that time, a sensation would come over us, thinking that there was somebody that we had at that meeting who seemed to pay attention to what we were saying, what we had to say about the experience that we would go through, and maybe helped them a little bit. And there was a feeling would come over us on the way home when it was so passive and we're just driving along and no traffic and all this. I can't explain it. A feeling of having maybe helped somebody with a situation we were all so familiar with, that they were newly bereaved and needed our help. Anyway, that feeling was just about every night we came home, we would have that sensation, that feeling. And so it's just a matter of, we have that, we don't know why, we don't know how, we don't know anything about it except, and we can't explain it, but it happened to us.
Okay. All right. So if you didn't hear the story, I bet you did though. The idea was, once you were in this situation where you were giving of yourself, and you just described a 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. Who wants to be away from home at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night? But you did it. And you're driving home, and you couldn't explain why, but there was this feeling. And I'm not going to be afraid of the word feeling. Right? I know it's like, well, it doesn't matter how you feel, it matters, but it absolutely matters how you feel. And there was something about that was hard to put a description to it, but it just felt right. I'm going to suggest that that's one approach that we can take to the question of what is the meaning of my life? And do I know if I am on the path to find meaning in my life? And I want to suggest that this example, and I'm sorry for your loss, but this example might be a perfect way of getting at that question in a way that would make sense to Luther. Right? What does it mean, and you've all done this before, that moment where you have found yourself in a situation where for whatever reason, you're not even thinking it through. You're not expecting anything. Sometimes we do stuff and we think, well, this is going to help me. Other times we just do something. You know, you're walking along and all of a sudden, oh, you need help changing your tire. Okay, and you just start to do it. And then when you walk away from that, you feel good. I don't know of any other language to use. But that is something to pay very, very close attention to, because the feeling is not what matters, but why do you feel that way? Luther might give us some ideas as to understanding why it is whenever you empty yourself of your power for the sake of another person, why does that feel right? Because maybe it's not even good, but why does it feel right? I'm going to stop there. Any thoughts, questions, or objections, anything you want to add to that before we get right into Luther? Because I think Luther has an answer. Go ahead, please.
You said that. It's not necessarily good or bad. It just feels right. This is what I should be. This is what I should be doing.
Yes, it feels right. Let me also say that for Luther, law and gospel were always about an effect, not whether you knew what the law was or what the gospel is, right? So having somebody come up and say, hey, the law is the 10 Commandments, and since you can't do it, God will intervene into our lives, and then God will, take upon God's self our sin and our brokenness, and then God will give you righteousness so that you yourself will be set free. There's the gospel, and that's not law and gospel. That's talking about law and gospel. The confessions of our church actually go so far as to say, every moment of your life is a law or a gospel moment. Are you putting someone into bondage that you have no right to place them in? That's law. Do you bind people's conscience? When people get done speaking to you or listening to you, do they feel as though they have somehow been judged and convicted? If so, then you have brought the law. Do people experience liberation from their brokenness? That's the gospel. And so, in a way, I'm not afraid of talking about how we feel, even though I know a lot of Protestants don't like talking like that, because what they want to say is, it doesn't matter how you feel. All you got to do is listen to me and just trust me, right? As opposed to the idea that God is actually at work doing something in your life. So feelings, I don't know how else to get at it, are going to be things we're going to be tripping all over today. So, would you mind if we just get right into the text so we might be able to see what I'm talking about with this? So if I could, I know, that we ended last time on page 121. Is that right? All right. Let's go back to page 121. There's two kinds of sin, Luther says, just like there's two kinds of righteousness. The first kind of sin is the sin that we're just born into, the brokenness of our life, the curse of humanity, or being, not curse of humanity, but that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sin. Let's just call it sin. Original sin, we're all born into it. That's alien. We didn't do anything to deserve it. We didn't create the problem. Christians and Apostle Paul point back to the fall, Adam and Eve, that act of disobedience. After that, there's a brokenness in creation. It's all wonderful. It's all beautiful, right? That comes from outside of us. You have absolutely nothing to do with it. It's just part of who you are. That's alien sin. That's original sin. And then God hits that original sin and says, well, how's God going to manage the brokenness of our creation? Not creation. The brokenness that we in the created order live in. And God's just going to give you faith, give you grace, and God's just going to fix that. But I still live life wanting more than I have, hating people that don't see the world the same as I do. So I still live in sin, even though the original sin has been taken care of, right? So then there's the things I do every day. That's a different kind of sin. Luther calls that your actual sin. So sin, as we talk about it, is not just the things you do, it's the condition that we live in, but God takes care of that through God's promise. Yet we still live in a world that even though God has handed me righteousness, I'm not going to say you, handed me righteousness, I still hate people. So what's the deal? So Luther differentiates. There's original sin, and then there's your actual sin. Original sin is dealt with for Luther at your baptism when you receive the Holy Spirit. So the consequence of original sin is over with. But I still have to live with the consequence of my actual sin. And so Luther says, so then you have another righteousness. There's a righteousness that God gives you, And then there's the way that you interact with the world. And your righteousness is what manages the sins that you will commit today. I'm already confusing myself. But do you hear what Luther's saying? There's two different kinds of ways of understanding sin. There's the sin we're born into. There's that natural inclination we have to hate what doesn't make sense to us. And all of that, Luther says that's fixed at your baptism. And then there's the stuff you do all the time, despite your baptism, to hurt the world. And Luther also says, but you also have a righteousness. What do you think? What do you think? Was that clear enough, or do we need to clarify it? We have time if we need to clarify these two kinds of sins and these two kinds of righteousness. Please.
Well, I'm just going to say the second kind of righteousness is not a gift. Would that be correct?
Interesting. It's not a gift.
Not like the first. We talked about the first one being a gift.
Yeah, no, and actually you just not like the first, it's right from Luther, yes. So is it a gift, or is it what we do with the gift? It's like an inheritance, right? The money you get, that's the money. Now what are you going to do with it? What do you think about that? Is that a way of?
What I was getting at was, do we not also have the gift of free will? And if we do, can we then follow up on that and not do the second righteousness?
There we go. Let's go ahead and say that. Let's go ahead and say that. So in our freedom, Christ sets us free from the power of our sin. In our freedom, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to live it out? That's the part where you have all the choice in the world. So what we say is you don't choose whether or not you have faith. God chose that. You don't choose whether or not God's grace applies to you. God makes that decision. What you choose is what you're going to do with those things, and that's called love. So faith is what God does, and it's my relationship with God, right? That gives me the righteousness that I then either apply to my relationships with you or withhold. And that's all on me. What do you think?
I agree with you. I've just, we've mentioned before that Luther's going with these two kinds of righteousness, kind of paralleling Jesus' two commandments.
Yes.
And then it gets down to, can you have one and not the other?
Yeah.
Can you have faith and not do good works? And then that was why I was bringing up the goodwill, because it seems like people can have faith and still hate their neighbor.
Yes. They sure can. And people can never have one time ever heard the concept or the words Jesus Christ and still be good. Paul says this in Romans chapter 2. Even the pagans know the law of God. All right. Well, let's get into Luther and see if we can't so right now I am purposefully wanting these waters real muddy. All right? So let's get in and see if we can't find some clarity. So Luther, right, when he said so we have the left column, like literally as you're looking at your left-handed column, at the very bottom, remember what it says? We read in Romans 6:19, this righteousness is set opposite of our actual sin. He's talking about proper righteousness. For just as you once yielded your members to impurity and to greater and greater iniquity, so now yield your members to righteousness for sanctification. Therefore, through the first righteousness, this is God's gift to you, the voice of the bridegroom says to the soul, I am yours. So the first righteousness that we get at our baptism is God saying, I'm yours. God makes the move, not us. Okay? But through the second comes the voice of the bride who says, I am yours. That's my voice. That's your voice. So God in baptism says, I'm yours. And we, in our lives, say to God, through our righteousness and righteous acts and love, we're going to get to this, I'm yours. So we do have a role to play in our relationship with God, but ours isn't where it begins. We don't determine whether there's a relationship. God does. We determine how we are going to live into that. Does that make sense? Actually, I think it makes a lot of sense. Okay? Let's keep going. The soul, I am yours. But through the second voice, the voice of the bride answers, I am yours. Then the marriage is consummated. It becomes strong and complete in accordance with the Song of Solomon. Let's keep going. My beloved is mine, I am his. Then the soul no longer seeks to be righteous in and for itself. It has Christ as its righteousness and therefore only seeks the welfare of another. So what is he saying? When you exercise your proper righteousness, what are you doing? You're loving the world, not yourself. You're loving the world. That's what it says here. The righteousness, therefore, seeks only the welfare of others. Thoughts, questions, objections? All right. I thought we would do this. Let's let Luther speak a little bit more for himself before we draw all this together. And I try and come up with at least one attempt to explain where it is in our lives we find meaning and why we find meaning in those places. And why does it seem to always have something to do with the ways that we're loving other people? Okay? This is why every one of us understands at some point that it doesn't matter how much money you make, it doesn't matter what kind of job you have, none of those things ultimately will give meaning to your life. We all know this. So where does meaning come from? We'll get there. Can we go on page 122? There's so much we could cover. But I'm going to cover the stuff that just gets right to it. We're going to be on the right-hand side. As you were to lay your right hand there, on that right-hand column, there is a paragraph that starts with Paul's meaning. Would somebody like to do this? Would somebody like to read that? Oh, you know what? I better. I'm sorry. I got the mic. Paul's meaning is that when each person has forgotten herself and emptied himself of God's gift, she should conduct herself as though her neighbor's weakness, sin, and foolishness were her very own. Let's just stop there. How does a Christian act in the world? Well, if I'm relating to you and if I'm conducting myself with you, how am I supposed to treat you? That's a good place to start. Treat me the way, I'm going to treat you the way I would want to be treated. This is awesome. Keep going.
Without judgment.
Without judgment. Have you ever wondered why it is that Jesus is just so adamant that you not judge other people? And when I was brought up, the reason that Jesus didn't want me to judge you and you to judge me is because that's obnoxious. But that's not what this is. It's deeper. It's deeper than that. Let's keep going. How do I conduct myself as though your weakness, sin, and foolishness are mine? So, let's ask this question. What would Jesus do? Remember that? Remember that little thing here? And then Lance Armstrong took over for Jesus and got his, right? I love the Lance Armstrong story. I love how a guy can go from being the most hated man on the planet to now he's got like his whole life back. Have you noticed? Like Lance Armstrong has an entire career. He was one of the earliest investors in Uber, so he's still super rich. And now he's got these podcasts that are some of the most listened to podcasts in the sports world. And on almost every podcast, at some point or another, he acknowledges, yep, and remember when I did those steroids and lied to everybody? Doggone it. And everybody just moved right past him. So he got the second round of those little bracelets. That first round, though, was what would Jesus do? Well, tell me, what's the kind of stuff that Jesus did? How did Jesus conduct himself as though his neighbor's weakness, sin, and foolishness were his very own? What kind of stuff did Jesus do in his life?
He healed people.
Jesus healed people. So is that what we do? Let's keep going.
He hung out with tax collectors.
He hung out with tax collectors and sinners, didn't he? What else did he do? He listened, absolutely. What else did he do?
He died on the cross for our sins.
Now, there you go. That's interesting. He did die on a cross for something that had nothing to do with him. Now we're starting to get into what Luther's talking about. Emptied himself of his gifts and conducted himself as though his neighbor's weakness, sin, and foolishness were his very own. Isn't that what Jesus did? We talk about it all the time. Jesus died for my sins. Well, what does that even mean? Seriously, what does that mean? Jesus died for my sins. What? So for Luther, ethics do not come from the things that Jesus did in his lifetime. Being nice to people, being kind. The ethics for a Lutheran come to the question of what did Jesus do on the cross? And that's our ethical example. So let's spend some time with this. What did what did Jesus do? Awesome. How? This is supposed to be awkward, by the way, right? This is supposed to be awkward and nearly these are questions are meant to be somewhat unanswerable. So please, just stick with me, okay?
He interceded with his Father to forgive them.
What does it mean to intercede? No, this is great. Like, I'm not challenging you. What is an intercession?
Talking to somebody on somebody's behalf.
I am getting in the middle of this. It's meddlesome. Interceding on behalf of other people is sticking your nose where it does not belong. Intercession means, oh, you came for him? No, I'm going to be right here. I'm getting in the middle of this. Right? So what does God do in Jesus Christ but stand between us and, I don't know, let's think it through. Let's think it through, please.
Is this where he has an effect on what we would call the alien sin? Is that Christ taking on the alien sin for us
Sure.
that we have no control over?
Yeah, because God didn't do it. Why is our brokenness God's problem? And believe me, there were plenty at the time, in the ancient Near East, there were plenty of religious traditions that suggested your problems are not God's problems. You are the problem, right? But this is a whole new way of understanding that the creative force of the universe will actually enter into your existence and intercede for you, stand between you and your brokenness. This is the cross. And so if that's what Christ does, then Luther says that's what we do. Feeding people, great. Jesus fed people. That's wonderful, right? Taking care, hanging out with the people that the rest of the world despises. All of that is wonderful. But ultimately, what makes it Christian is that it is when you take the burdens that belong to someone else and say, these are mine now. Yeah, it's that support group. It's that, you know what? Rather than be at my house on Sunday night watching The Walking Dead with my wife, which is what I do on Sunday. I shouldn't tell you that. It's a great show, by the way. Do you have any idea how little I want to be away from my house at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night? I will do it, but it's not what I want. And so how in the world could I leave the warmth of my house and my family and my television set and leave that and go and listen to people who are sad and in despair, and by the time I'm done with that, I have a feeling, an overwhelming sense that I have done something right. How in the world does that happen? Because nothing in that conversation had anything to do with making you happy. And at that moment, I want to suggest this is probably when happiness might be the problematic word, but I would suppose that some of the most difficult moments in your life where you have interceded on behalf of another person and taken their burdens onto yourself, those might be the moments in your life where you have felt the most at peace. Like maybe you know what your life is. Let me stop there for a second. What do you think? Well, let's read Luther and see if we can find some of this, okay? Paul's meaning is that when each person has forgotten him or herself, emptied themselves of God's gift, a person should conduct themselves as though their neighbor's weakness, sin, and foolishness were their very own. That's what proper righteousness looks like. Your problem is my problem. Your foolishness, that's my foolishness. Your unchastity, that belongs to me. Now, that's not how churches operate. Our churches have operated in the past, and I know because I've been a part of these conversations, in which you say, hey, wait a minute. Now you're doing this thing. Do you know how bad it is what you're doing? Do you seem to understand how much it is that you're causing a problem? You need to do, that's not covering over someone's sin, is it? What is it? It's exposing it. Yes, it's judgment. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I do that. Pastor Jeff offered me a snack before I started all of this, and I said no, and so now I'm just operating on caffeine, and I should have taken you up on that, so I didn't mean to. Yeah, that's the opposite. The years I sat in Des Moines and in Iowa City and listened to leaders of our church stand up and explain other people's sin and why they would not participate in it, and I'm reading this stuff going, oh my gosh, are these people Lutherans? You want to see how far Luther will go with this? So check this out, okay? All right. A person should not boast or get puffed up, nor should, I'm just going to use Luther's language, I'm so sorry, okay? It's sexist, I'm sorry. Nor should he despise or triumph over his neighbor as if he were God or equal to God. Since God's prerogatives ought to be left to God alone, it becomes robbery when a person when a person in haughty foolhardiness ignores this fact. In the same way, that one takes the form of a servant in a command of the apostles in Galatians. Through love, be servants of one another. Let's keep going. Let's see how far Luther will go with this. Let's go over to 123. I'm going to skip the left-hand column until the end. You'll see why in a minute. Let's go to the right-hand column on page 123. The very top paragraph. Is it okay if I read this to you just so that it's on the mic? In like manner, he will treat all of us whenever we, on the ground of our righteousness, wisdom, or power, are haughty or angry with those who are unrighteous, foolish, or less powerful than we. He's saying, God does not expect you to be the judge. For when we act thus, and this is the greatest perversion, righteousness works against righteousness. My self-righteousness, identifying your problems, actually gets in the way of proper righteousness. If I am self-righteous, I cannot be properly righteous. So if I judge you and hold you accountable for something, what I am not doing is bearing your burdens. I'm giving you more. See, that's the problem with judgment, right? With judgment, I am actually adding burdens. Let's get going, right? Works against righteousness, wisdom against power, power against power. Here it is. Are you ready for it? For you are powerful, not that you may make the weak weaker by oppression, but that you may make them powerful by raising them up and defending them. You are wise not in order to laugh at the foolish and thereby make them more foolish, but that you may undertake to teach them as you yourself would wish to be taught. You are righteous that you may vindicate and pardon the unrighteous. Not that you may overly condemn, disparage, judge, and punish, for this is Christ's example for us. For God sent the Son into the world not to condemn the world, but the world might be saved through him. Let's stop there for a minute. Now, the rubber has hit the road. This is what righteousness looks like. No, you do not determine your relationship with God, right? No, you are not free from sin, but God will love you. God intercedes. That original sin that had nothing to do with you, God intercedes. God will give you righteousness, and God will forgive your sins. So now, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to take the thing that God has, which God has given to you, how are you going to give it away? That's how ethics works for Luther. And it's not the 10 Commandments. It's the crucifixion. I will stand between you and the punishment you deserve. Let me stop there. Thoughts, questions, or objections to this?
You're kind of teetering, in my mind, on good works.
Thank you. And in fact, what I'll say is, this is all good works. Good works, although they do not save you, I'm not going to go that far. I'm going to ask this question. The good works might not save you, but would those good works, if they allowed someone else to feel, all right, help me try it different. I'm trying to be very careful here. If someone standing over here is guilty of XYZ sin, right? Because we read the Bible, and the Bible said 3 times that a person was never supposed to do what this person's doing, right? Despite the fact that, right? And if I say, well, everybody look at this person over here. I mean, it's too bad that they're making all these terrible choices. I mean, they have the right, they have the freedom to make the right choice, but they continue to make the wrong choice. So this person over here, as much as we love you, sorry. Nope, we can't have this, and we can't have any of you doing this, right? That's how you destroy someone. That's how you destroy someone. It's demonic. At least it's demonic in the sense that it's set in opposition to Christ's example. Now Luther sets out Christ's example. What does Christ do to the unrighteous? Covers over it. Stands between that person and the problem. That's what righteousness looks like. I'm going to stop there. Thoughts? I mean, I feel like I'm dominating because I've got a lot more to go. I got a lot more places to go. Should we keep going? Please.
Well, in the Ten Commandments, which I agree law, but Luther's explanations oftentimes bring up gospel as far as I'm concerned.
Awesome.
Because I think it was the 8th commandment, we should not be lie, betray our neighbor or whatever. But, and this is really hard, put the best construction on all that he does.
Do you mind if I do this for the microphone because it's really important? No, so I don't mean to interrupt you. What Sharon is saying is, if you look at the 10 Commandments and Luther's explanation of the 10 Commandments, you can find gospel. And she uses as her example the 8th commandment. The 8th commandment is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie. But it's more than that. Don't bear false witness in the sense that, for instance, when you see your neighbor doing something, don't start witnessing about what that action is and what they intend with that action, right? That's gossip, judgment, whatever, however you want to say it. Instead, Luther says, it's not enough that we simply don't lie, but we explain our neighbor's actions using the best and most charitable construction of their actions. This is my very favorite explanation to any of the commandments that Luther gives. So what he's saying is, not only is it not enough to just not lie about people, but don't add judgment to their behavior. An addict, right? What do you say about this addict? Look at this person making all these choices. What a loser, right? And maybe those things might even be true, but what would be the most charitable way of explaining why somebody remains addicted? What's a charitable way of looking at that? This is an illness, right? We're going to engage with this person, not exclude this person. This is ethics. This is Christianity. You want to go any further with it? All right, so here's what I want to do. It's not enough that Luther says it one time. Luther says this all the time. So if I could, I would like to just take you. 1519, Luther wrote a commentary on the book of Galatians. This changed my life. So when he's commenting on, so this is the same year he writes this. He's commenting on Galatians chapter 6, verse 3. If anyone thinks they are something when they are nothing, they deceive themselves. That's Paul. Here's Luther's take on this. Why then does one person puff himself up against the other? And why do we not rather help one another? Furthermore, if there is anything in us, it is not our own. It is a gift of God. But if it is a gift of God, I love this, then it is entirely a debt that one owes to love. So if God has given you a gift, that is a debt you owe to others. Ready for this? This is what was similar to this. It was St. Ambrose who said, if you have 2 coats, the second coat that you own, you stole. That's what he believed. You stole it from the person who has no coat. Because you know that it's not, you know what I'm saying? It's this kind of ethic that's always been involved in Christianity, and that is that other people's problems are your problems. All right. So you owe a debt to love. Sounds like law. But the consequence of it is freedom. Well, we'll get to it. That is to the law of Christ. And if it is a debt owed to love, then I must serve others with it, not myself. Thus, my learning is not my own. It belongs to the unlearned. The debt is what I owe to them. My chastity is not my own. How long have Christians been wanting to use concepts and conversations like, for instance, inappropriate sexual behavior as something that kind of determines insiders and outsiders? But here's what Luther said. If I am chaste, it's not my own. It belongs to those who commit sins of the flesh, and I am obligated to serve them through it by offering it to God for them, by sustaining and excusing. And thus, with my respectability, veiling their shame before God and people, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, that these parts of the body that are less honorable are covered by those that are more honorable. Thus, my wisdom belongs to the foolish, my power to the oppressed. Thus, my wealth belongs to the poor, my righteousness to the sinners. For these are the forms of God of which we must empty ourselves in order that the form of a servant may be in us. Do you hear what Luther is saying? That's ethics. We're going to do for one another what Christ does for me. Christ covers over my weakness, my unrighteousness, my brokenness. So how do I relate to you? By doing the exact same thing. If Christ's benefits and gifts all belong to me, which is what Luther said, as though they're my very own, then I can do the same thing. But Luther's not talking about feeding the 5,000. Luther's not talking about being Luther's not talking about Jesus being kind. Luther's talking about Jesus dying on behalf of another. So let me stop there. What do you think? Is your wisdom really the possession of your neighbor who's the fool? When was the last time you did that? If there's an app out there right now that's meant to show the depth of it's a theological application that you can get, and it's meant to show the depths of the human condition, the brokenness of the human condition, and the depths of our hypocrisy. Have you seen this? It's called Twitter. It's a cesspool. Twitter is a cesspool. But if anybody believes that somehow there is a righteousness that just kind of exists in people, go on Twitter sometime. It's garbage. And if you've ever noticed that if you want any poll on Twitter, you don't cover over other people's unrighteousness, you pile on. So Luther says, if you are a Christian and you have been given the grace of God and you have faith, the way that is lived out is that I'm now going to do for you what Christ did for me. Cover over sin. Your problems are my problems. All right. Anybody want to take on that, or should I keep going? Please.
So it sounds like I have trouble with this word gift.
Yeah.
So if the first kind of righteousness is God's gift to us, I think the second kind of righteousness is our gift to others.
Yes. Can I repeat that? He says if the first kind of righteousness is God's gift to us, the second kind of righteousness is our gift to others. Yes. And do you want to say more about that?
No, I almost use the word prize
Why not?
because if it's your action, so gifts, you don't do anything to get a gift, right? It's just given to you.
Right.
But if you get a prize, it's usually a result for something you did.
Okay.
So sort of could think of the second kind of righteousness as a prize.
Absolutely. And in a way, you're not really giving away yours, something that's yours. Because the only thing I really have to give is my brokenness. That's judgment. That's what I would give you. But if God gives me the righteousness that comes from just simply covering over my brokenness, then I can give God's righteousness to others. So it's never really mine. It's a partnership. And that's good because it's not suggesting that people are bad. What is being suggested here is that you participate in divine righteousness. If you can give it away, then it's your possession. Even if it doesn't originate from you, this is what Luther says. You actually, he said it earlier, every act of Christ is your possession. All of Christ's righteousness is your possession. All of Christ's living, doing, and dying, it is yours as though it is yours alone. So what do? Now we give it away. I love this. So a life spent in good works is essential. Good works don't save us, but our salvation, God's gift of faith and love, make us kind of, well, we're going to get to the make us part in a minute. I don't know if you caught that. Did you get the part where Luther said, and if you won't do it, you should be made to? We'll get to that in a minute. This is the part where like, oh, come on, Luther, why do you always have to do this? Can I keep reading? This comes from, without question, the most probably well-known. If you went to college or if you went to a school someplace where you read Luther, maybe it was a parochial school of some sort, you read Freedom of a Christian. Ready for this? Accordingly, the good things we have from God should flow from one to the other and be common to all, so that everyone should put on his neighbor and so conduct himself towards him as if he himself were in the other's place. From Christ, the good things have flowed and are flowing into us. From Christ, the good things have flowed to us. We get these things in the gift of grace. This is faith, right? Now, let me see. Flowing to us. I'm sorry. He has put on, flowing into us. He has so put on us and acted for us as if he had been what we are. From us, they flow on to those who have need of them, so that I should lay before God my faith and my righteousness, that they may cover and intercede for the sins of my neighbor, which I take upon myself, and so labor and serve in them as though they were my very own. You see about the sin of your neighbor? That's your problem now. Whatever that sin is, we now act towards that person as if that was ours. Like, that's me. So the idea of withholding judgment is not just because it's obnoxious. It's because the act of judgment actually, in some ways, kind of places the gift in a shadow. I'll just put it that way. All right, stop. Thoughts, questions? Anything you want to do? Please.
Well, I would argue that covering over brokenness, whether it's our brokenness or covering over our neighbor's brokenness, is insufficient.
Okay. He says covering over brokenness is insufficient. So keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just want to make sure it's out there. Keep going.
Okay. So I would say, from my personal perspective, that the harder thing is what you do next.
So he said the harder thing is what do you do? Keep going.
Because that's where you have to tread the fine line between judgment
Yeah.
and helping the person
Yeah.
to overcome their brokenness.
Yes. Yep. So how do we do that when we ourselves don't have any conception of our own brokenness? So this comes back to, for instance, the person who believes that they've listened to some radio shows, maybe watched some news, maybe read a couple of books, and now all of a sudden they're an expert on tax policy. So much so that they could actually kind of come up with all kinds of ideas that will separate them from family members and everything else. And before you know it, they can't even talk to somebody because they're so convinced of their own righteousness, and that their own rightness of their position, that it never even occurs to them to imagine how broken that their ideas always are. Say more, keep coming. What were you want to say about that? Like, how do we know what we're supposed to do? Like, where does the impulse come from?
Yeah, and in the real world, and I'll use an example that we had in another church years and years ago of a sex offender who just showed up at our church because he was told by a larger church that he'd probably feel more welcome at our church. Okay, so we took him in, but of course in that situation, there are boundaries that have to be set.
Yeah.
Particularly since this involved children.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were big discussions, big arguments, yada, yada, yada. How do we love him and yet set the proper boundaries without being judgmental?
So this is a great example. This is a great example. So he's saying, all right, so we love everyone. We cover over your sin. We cover over your brokenness. But where's the boundary? Right? So if I cover over, and the example you used was a sex offender, registered sex offender that started coming to your church, and the question was, okay, we love this person, they're not a sinner, but now we've got a person who is a habitual line stepper, who has shown through their actions that no boundary matters to them and that they'll hurt somebody else, do we just welcome them into our community? I want to ask you what you think, but I'm not going to. I made that mistake. Pastor Jeff and I have talked about this. In my second parish, a person started coming to the church, and it was we were growing. We were about to have a massive new member class, and I was just so proud of myself. And I called this person up because he had been visiting, and I said, "Hey, you know what? Let's get together. We're about to have a new member class." And he says, "I just need to let you know, I'm out of jail on parole." And then he told me the full story of what he had done, and I'm like, "Ugh, what?" And I'm like, "What do I do?" And he said, and then he laid that on me. He said, "So the question is, am I forgiven or am I not forgiven?" And because I was young, I thought that forgiving someone and loving them and covering over their shame was the same thing as giving them access to the children at our church. And I didn't understand what to do with that. And so basically, the process was massive. It was an unbelievably difficult moment in the life of that church. This person eventually became a part of that church, and every other person who was part of that new member class left. We didn't have a visitor in that church for a full year. And I'm still not sure whether or not that was the right choice to make. Because is there a difference between covering over someone's shame in the way that Christ covers over our shame and our guilt with righteousness, and holding people accountable to predictable action, the predictable consequences of their actions? So now we're in a conundrum here, aren't we? How far do we take this? I was wrong. What were you going to say?
One of the Bible verses is you don't give pearls to swine.
The Bible verse is don't give pearls to swine. It's the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says, so here's my problem. I'm going to make this confusing. Jesus says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine. For if you do, they will trample them underfoot and then turn and maul you. That's how he ends the Sermon on the Mount. Later on, in the book of Matthew, a woman comes to Jesus and says, would you take care of my daughter? Would you heal my daughter? And Jesus says, it's not right. It's not right to give what belongs to the children to the dogs. Remember that? Have you ever wondered, like, why did Jesus just call this girl and her mother dogs? I've always thought that was a horrible thing to do. And remember what she said? What's that? But even the dogs get to eat from what falls off the table, the scraps. And what does Jesus do? Remember? All right, right on. Good for you. What did he just do? He just gave what was holy to the dogs. Jesus said, if you do that, though, the consequence is they will maul you. What happens to Jesus at the end of the Gospel of Matthew? He is mauled, right? And so sometimes I wonder, so this is that moment then that's like, okay, well, there's what Jesus is and there's what I am. So yes, Jesus is saying, do not give these things to others because they will not appreciate them, they will not love them, nor will they hold you in high esteem. In fact, they will demolish you for doing that. And then Jesus does it, and he actually has to experience the consequence of that. So there's our conundrum. What happens when we give something holy to somebody who does not want it? What is one of the consequences? That they will turn on you and maul you. So this is the question. Does that mean we don't do it? Jesus' example is to do it. I'm with you. I don't think I'm there. But Luther places us in a position where we've got to start to think about, okay, so what does my righteousness really look like? I agree with you. I don't have any question. I don't have any way to answer that question. What do we do about boundaries? Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Please.
In the example that you gave with the sex offender, you may be mauled and being humiliated and have to live with the guilt, but there's another child that was involved.
You got
so
it.
Now you put that child at risk.
Love it.
So I can see where you would
There you go.
stop that.
You saw exactly where I was going, and you anticipated it. Just kidding. He came up. He said, okay, so if you cover over the sin of the sex offender, Nate, then you're willing to take the mauling. But if a child gets hurt, that's not your right. It's not my right. So here, you know how Luther talks about it? Luther says, I don't need you to intervene for me. I have the gospel. I can turn the other cheek. But it's not appropriate for me to turn the other cheek of my neighbor. So if somebody's attacking, defend, right? So turn the other cheek means I don't need protection. I have the gospel, but I have no right to turn the cheek of my neighbor. And I think that's where you're coming from. Oh my gosh, so complicated, isn't it? So complicated. None of it's supposed to be easy. This is God getting into the mud. Please.
Well, I was just going to ask a question. I can see where you probably should not let the sex offender or the murderer or whatever your prisoner friend was, not friend, but person.
Yeah.
But is there a way that you can minister to him privately?
Yeah. Because one of the options isn't exclude, forget. So the question might be, how can I best bear your burden with you without exposing other people to burdens? See, and this is what you get to do with your righteousness, that God trusts you to do something with that. And I suppose that's up to you. What do you think?
I think you could minister to them privately.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. So hard because what's the cross of Jesus? What does it get him? Dead. It gets him dead, gets him suffering, right? And so, okay, all right. So does that mean that for whatever reason, what it is that we end up doing with our life, none of it was necessarily intended to make our lives easier? In fact, when we get into the mud with other people, we get muddy. So what's in it for us, if anything? I don't know that it matters, but can we go back to the story? By the way, there's a couple of other things here. He splits up people and all kinds, the difference between public individuals. I mean, maybe that's the way to answer it. As a public individual, I am obligated to care for people who are not making these decisions. I can't make decisions for you. So maybe if I'm a public individual, if I like, let's say I'm the sheriff or maybe I'm a judge, guess what? I don't get to just cover over what you just did. If I represent a community, it's okay for a judge to say, hang. That's what he's saying. Sometimes people have to intervene because their obligations are to a community and not to themselves. Like you said, I can turn the other cheek on me, but I'm not going to turn the cheek of the person that's just been harmed. This is why in my sermons, I try always to say, when it comes to abuse, I don't know where to go with this. Never, ever, ever just say, oh, well, this person's abusing me, but I'm just supposed to tolerate it. You know, there are times to set boundaries. But going beyond the complication of all of those awesome ideas, can we come back to this notion of what is in this, what happens to us? So let's go back to your story, or to anybody's story. You can tell your own story. In my case, it was the Van Kirks. Our neighbors who, when we were growing up, they lived they shared a backyard with us. With two backyards became a football field. And they were our very best friends, and they were the kind of people who had a garage that was nicer than their home, right? Not an uncommon thing. And everything of value to that family was in the garage. That's where they hung out. That's where they ate. You know, that's where they had parties, and everything was the garage for this family. All right, we have a storm, an Iowa storm, knocks down the neighbor's tree, not our next door neighbor, the Van Kirks, our backyard neighbors, but their neighbor, the Sharps, had a tree. Wind knocked the tree down onto the garage and demolished it. The insurance company said, we're not paying for any of that because it's an act of God. That was the first time I had learned, that, everybody must believe in God now all of a sudden. It was an act of God, and so what that meant was the insurance company was not going to pay for any of this. I'm here to tell you, right? talking about, mid-small town Iowa. Nobody has enough money to replace their cars, their bicycles, and their garage on their own. Nobody had enough money, including the Van Kirks. So what's going to happen? They've got this thing just laying there, this grand structure now. It's just half laying on the ground, and the insurance company says, this is your problem. So the neighborhood shuts down. Everybody descends on the Van Kirks. And everybody starts to work and do whatever we can to start to tear this garage apart, at least to do something so they didn't have to pay other people to do it. My parents let me do the most dangerous things I had ever done in my life at that moment because we were all just going to help the Van Kirks. It took about 3 days. All day. We shut down our family business. And for 3 days, we just helped the Van Kirks. We'd wake up in the morning, we'd go over there, taking shingles off, all that stuff. At nighttime, when the time came for dinner, we all sat around the table, and it was complete silence. We were exhausted. We'd eat, and we went right back out in the backyard to help the Van Kirks. I remember as a child thinking, this is awesome. There was just something, there was this feeling. Right? It was just right. And there was no arguing around the dinner table. We were at peace. Everyone seemed to be in this magically beautiful place because none of us had even 5 seconds to think about ourselves. Everything was about the Van Kirks. And at the end of those 3 days, when all that work was done, I think we all went into a little bit of a mourning because we realized we're going to have to go back to our regular lives. You ever had experiences like that? Where there's just something about, listen, we lost money. Our neighbors had been devastated. There was nothing good about any of this stuff. We were taking massive risks where we could have gotten really, really hurt in order to help this family. There was not a single thing about that was good, and I bet everybody in that neighborhood can remember those days. So what is that? What do you think Luther would say it is? Where does that feeling come from? Where does that sense that this is right come from? You're acting like Christ would act. And there is something to that I can't give a lot of language to. But I happen to think that might be the meaning of our lives. I don't know how to call it that. I don't know what to say. But there's something about when we empty ourselves for other people that we are in touch with why we are actually here. So even though Christ calls us to bear one another's burdens with that, something even more profound happens. We enter into something like holiness. We enter into the Trinity. You remember all the times with the Gospel of John or 1 John that says, abide in me, and I'll abide in you. And if you love one another, then you're loving me, and then I will love you, and you will be in the Spirit will be in the Son. It all becomes really confusing. But what is really happening there is this notion that when we live in Christ, and we live as Christ lives for others, we end up becoming something very closely resembling Jesus. It almost gets terrifying. We start to participate in the will of God. So there's something in it for us. Go ahead, Don.
Well, the way I look at it is that we talked about this process of sanctification.
Yes.
Christianity isn't the only religion that has a process like that.
Yeah.
And we talk about obtaining nirvana or bliss.
Yeah.
So if we can just call it bliss, if you're sanctified, there's this feeling of bliss. So I would postulate that every time you have an experience like this, you're getting a little sample of that.
Sure.
Because the righteousness that you have is increasing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering if what happens is, because since we possess Christ, this is kind of where a conversation about holiness has always been an interesting issue with Luther, because is he talking about a process whereby you're becoming holy, or does he say you possess Christ? And if you possess Christ, there's no process to it. However, it feels like there's a process, right? And even in this text, he says it's something that comes to completion when we die. And my estimation is what happens is that we have the promise, and then life is about living into that promise. It's about an awareness. But you know what? Here's the deal. A 12-year-old can get there. And for some people, it takes them their whole life and they never even come close. But we all possess Christ. Now, are we living in the full awareness of what it is that Christ has done for us? And that I'd say probably not. We are saints and sinners at the same time. So there will always be something about our brokenness that will get in the way, I think, of what God has made us, of our recognition of it. But I'm not sure whether or not that means we're still growing. I just don't know. That's just kind of, what do you think?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is, because I go on with the process of sanctification, and I think sometimes we go forward, sometimes we go backwards.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there's enough in the text that would suggest that that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it.
The other aspect of that, I think there's a balance, because we talk about sometimes where, our righteousness is more evident, sometimes our sin is more evident,
Yeah.
and I think the whole thing kind of balances out.
Yeah, yeah. The recognition of the gifts of God will always be a process. Will always be a process. Even if we possess them fully, I think the way we live that out is something that we will always do as saints and sinners. But that doesn't mean that just because we live on this side of the resurrection and just because we continue to experience the brokenness of our actual sins, that we are helpless. In fact, Luther said exactly the opposite. Not only are you not helpless, but you possess all of the gifts of Christ and you can do something with them. And I want to go one step further to say, right? Let me just say this. That feeling you get when you are living out the righteousness that God gave you is, as far as I'm concerned, that's communion with God. That's unity with God. And here's why, and I'll be done. I'm going a little bit far. Remember when I started this and I said the difference between the love of God and the love of humans for Luther? Luther said the difference between God's love and human love is that God loves unlovable things. Humans love things that are lovable. Our love always gravitates towards that lifts us up, whereas God's love always moves this way. God can love unlovable things. Jesus says, love your enemies. What? How am I supposed to love my enemy? Well, God can. Can we? Absolutely you can, when you cover over their brokenness. And so you can do it. We can be like God, but there's a good chance that we might not choose that. But that's not our relationship with God. That's how we're living out our relationship with God in the midst of our communities. But that it's that feeling when you do those things, you don't know whether or not the people that you were helping were bad-mouthing you when you left. You don't know when you're handing out pearls of the Gospels whether or not someone's going to trample them underfoot or turn around and maul you. You've all done the right thing and paid a huge price for it, but it didn't change the fact that you had done the right thing. So for Luther, we can participate literally in the acts of God in the world, and that's what a Christian does. That's our ethic. Our ethic is take what God has given you and spread it around. All right, it's 7 minutes over. That's too much. So this is, I think, the beginning of understanding for Luther how it is that not only that we are in relationship with God and one another, but where the power of God, what role that plays in our life. That's enough for now. You all have survived 4 weeks of this conversation. I can promise you this. This kind of stuff takes years to process. So just kind of let it percolate. As you read the scripture, though, maybe look for some of this. Maybe look for this idea of God inviting us into this moment of righteousness and the work of righteousness. And, what might be in it for you? Is that enough? Does anybody want the last word? Thank you for your time, everybody. I really appreciate you. No, thank you. If you need anything, I'll be around.